All right, my friends, are we ready for that exciting step of visualizing the clusters? Well, yes, we are 100% ready. We are 100% ready because indeed we have our yk-means dependent variable, which contains, you see, all the different cluster values for each of the customers. And so now we're going to use that variable in order to plot these clusters on a nice 2D chart. All right, so let's do this. Let's start by creating a new code cell. And the way we're going to do this will be by doing several scatter plots for each of the clusters. So we will actually scatter plot cluster 1, then we will scatter plot cluster 2 up to cluster 5. All right, so you know how to scatter plot. There is this function which we actually used before in both regression and classification. That function is, of course, scatter. And this function belongs to the matplotlib.pyplot module, and therefore we're going to call our shortcut here plt, from which we will call indeed this scatter function. All right, so remember, what do we have to input inside this scatter function? Well, actually everything is here. First, we have to input the x coordinates of the points, then the y coordinates of the points, then that's the size. We'll actually specify a size. That's the color. We will also specify a color to, distinguish our different clusters. And we will also specify, well, it is not here, but we'll specify a label because indeed we would like to label each one of our clusters. Okay, great. There we go. So as we said, we're going to use the scatter function to scatter plot each of the 5 clusters. So we're actually going to call 5 times this scatter function with different inputs. And now we're starting with cluster number 1, cluster of index 0. So now the question is, according to you, how are we going to scatter plot all the customers who belong to cluster 1, to cluster of index 0? This customer, this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. All the customers that have a 0 here will be scatter plotted on this 2D chart thanks to this first function we're calling. All right, well, let's just take it step by step. As we just saw, the first argument we have to input here are the x coordinates of these customers who belong to cluster 1. All right, so, well, naturally, the first thing we must do is start with x, right? Because x contains exactly the different customers. Remember, x is actually the matrix of 2 columns containing the annual income in the first column and the spending score in the second column, and each row of x corresponds to a different customer. And therefore, for each customer, the x coordinate will be the annual income and the y coordinate will be the spending score. So here, in order to get the x coordinate, which is our first argument, well, we have to specify in a pair of square brackets, and then after the comma, well, the index 0, because that's the first index of the matrix x, therefore the index of the first column, the annual income, which is indeed the x coordinate. But as you notice, I put this index of the column after the comma. And now guess what must be before the comma, and which corresponds, of course, to the rows we want to select in this cluster 1. Well, there you go. I have a question for you. According to you, what are the rows of the matrix of features x that we want to select for this first cluster? Well, very simply, these rows have to be all the rows corresponding to the customers who belong to cluster 1. And how can we specify this here, to the left of this comma, to specify that we only want to select the rows of the customers who belong to cluster 1? Well, the trick is to use our yk-means variable. We're going to call our yk-means variable, and we're going to specify here to the left of this comma, to select the rows, where we're going to specify yk-means double equal and 0, so that it will select among these rows here all the customers for which the yk-means variable equals 0. Therefore, that means it will select this customer, this customer, this customer, you see, all the ones for which yk-means is equal to 0. And that's the trick in order to here indeed select all the rows corresponding to the customers that belong to cluster 0. So this selects all these rows, and this select the first column, meaning the annual income, which indeed corresponds to the x coordinate. All right, so a bit tricky at first, but now it all makes sense. We're just selecting the right rows and the right column. And now we're going to do the same for the y coordinate, and we're going to do this efficiently. So I'm copying this. And now according to you, for the y coordinate, what do we need to replace here? Well, for the rows, well, that's exactly the same. We still want the same rows corresponding to the customers for which y k-means is equal to 0, meaning the customers of cluster 0. But for the column, we of course want to select the index 1, which corresponds to the spending score, right? X has two columns, the column of index 0, which is the annual income, and the column of index 1, which is the spending score. And that's exactly how we select here all the y coordinates of the customers that belong to cluster 1, cluster of index 0. All right, so that was a trick, and now let's add the simple stuff. So that was the size, S equals, and we're going to choose a size of 100 here, which will, just display some big enough points so that we can see them. And each of these points will be, of course, the different customers of cluster 0. Okay, and then, as we said, we want to add a color for which the parameter's name is C. And, well, let's just choose our first cluster to have the color red. Okay, sorry, I'm going to clean all this because you don't see much, but there you go. That's the size and that's the color. And then, as we said, we also want to add actually a label, right, to name each of our clusters. And this cluster, we will call it, very simply cluster 1. We can give different names after all, once we visualize the clusters, but so far we will just call them cluster 1. Okay, so that's how we scatter plot our first cluster containing all the customers belonging to cluster 1. All right, perfect. So now let's do the same for the other clusters. So I'm going to actually copy this line of code, and we're going to paste it right below to plot the second cluster, and then the third one, the fourth one, and the fifth one. All right, so according to you now, what do we have to change in this second row in order to plot the second cluster? Well, if you understood how we plotted that first cluster, then you should have absolutely no issue to figure out how to plot this second cluster. Of course, what we only need to change here in the coordinates is that value of y k-means, which this time is not equal to 0, but should be equal to the value of cluster number 2, which has index 1, right? Because indexes in Python start from 0. And same here, same for the y coordinate. And then all the rest is the same. This selects the x coordinate, this selects the y coordinate, then we choose the same size. Then of course we're going to choose a different color. We're going to choose this time blue, and then the label will be this time cluster 2. All right, very simply. Now let's do the same for the third cluster. This time y k-means will be equal to 2. Same here. Then we choose the same size, a new color, which will be this time, well, green. And the label will be cluster 3. Okay, let's plot that again. Y k-means will be equal this time to 3. That's for cluster number 4. Then here, same, y k-means equal 3. Same size, different color, which will be this time. We must start to become an artist here. So let's see, cyan, this color, it's pretty nice. Cluster this time 4. And finally, last cluster, this time we want to select all the customers belonging to cluster number 5, for which all the y k-means value are equal to 4, right? So here replacing again 3 by 4, and same size, new color, which we will choose to be magenta, and finally label cluster number 5. And congratulations, we just plotted our 5 clusters. But we're going to do even better. We're now going to plot the centroids of each of these clusters. And to do this, we will use once again the scatter function, inside which, well, that's the same. We have to input the different coordinates of these 5 centroids, and then a size, which will be a bigger size so that we can really see them well, and another color and a label. All right, let's do this. So here you can't really guess what is going to be the x coordinate and the y coordinate. So I'm going to tell you right away, you can actually get them thanks to our k-means object, because the k-means class, as we saw when implementing the elbow method, contains some attributes. We already used one of its attributes, which was the WCSS value. Remember, that was inertia. And now we're going to use another attribute from our k-means object, which is simply cluster centers. right? And the cluster centers attribute is actually a 2D array in which the rows correspond to the different centroids and the columns correspond to their coordinates. And so here in the scatter function, the coordinates of these centroids will be first k-means. So here I'm calling the k-means object from which I'm getting this attribute we want, which is, there you go, this one, cluster centers. And since, as we said, it is a 2D array containing in the rows, well, the different centroids and in the columns their coordinates, well, for the rows we're going to take everything. That's why I'm adding a con here. But for the column here, since we're dealing with the x coordinate, we're just going to take the first column, which has index 0, and which corresponds, of course, to the x coordinate of these cluster centers. All right, then we're going to copy this because now we'll have to enter the y coordinates of these centroids, these cluster centers, and therefore I'm pasting that here and replacing 0 here by the index 1, which corresponds, of course, to the index of the second column inside this cluster centers array, and which corresponds, of course, to the y coordinate of the centroid. All right, very simply. So now we have both the x and y coordinates, and so we're going to add the rest of the simple stuff, which are first the size, and here we're going to choose a larger size like 300 in order to clearly highlight the centroids among all these observation points corresponding to the customers in each cluster. So s equals 300, and then a color, which we'll choose to be, yellow. We will clearly see them. And finally, a label, which we'll choose to be, in quotes, centroids. And perfect. And now we're basically done with the 2D plot. All there's left to do here is just to add a nice title, a nice label to the x-axis, a nice label to the y-axis, and then just show it. So we're going to do this now. We're going to do this efficiently. Well, I have an idea. We can actually take what we did here so that we don't have to retype everything again, and we'll just change the input. So there we go. I'm going to paste that right here. So let's see. For the title, we're going to choose, well, let's say clusters of customers, right? Then for the X label, well, we're going to choose annual income, right? Because remember that the X coordinates corresponds to the first column here, annual income, and the Y coordinate will be the spending score. So annual income here, and we can specify that it is indeed in K dollars. Okay, good. And then for the Y label now, as we just said, it is the spending score, and we can specify the scale from 1 to 100. Perfect. And finally, plt.show. So there you go, my friends. We're ready to visualize the clusters. So let's hope I didn't make any mistake, and let's play the cell in order to, yes, perfect, in order to visualize the clusters. So we can clearly see that we have 5 clusters of customers, and so now let's analyze them in order to understand what they are, because I remind that the goal of doing this, the goal for the model to do clustering here is to understand better their customers. It's to extract some insights from their customers in order to, boost the business by making some offers, some relevant offers to the different clusters of customers that are in this group. Okay, so let's see. Let's start with this cluster, which should correspond to the color cyan, which therefore is cluster 4. Actually, I have an idea. We can actually add the legend. And the trick to do that is to call the legend function by still matplotlib. See, if we play this now, we will get the legend. See, that's easier for us now. So indeed, as we just said, this cluster of color cyan corresponds to cluster number 4. And what is it characterized by? Well, this cluster basically contains all the customers that have a low annual income and who spends very few in the mall. All right, so that's the first cluster. Then this cluster here corresponds to cluster number 5 and contains all the customers who earn a high annual income but still who don't spend much in the mall. Then this cluster, cluster number 1, is the cluster of the customers who earn a low annual income and yet have a high spending score. All right, so interesting. I'll make my comments afterwards on how to leverage these clusters and, boost the business maybe. So there we go. Let's continue. This cluster corresponds to cluster number 3 and contains all the customers that earn a high annual income and also who spend a lot in the mall. And finally, there is this cluster, which is like an average cluster and contains customers that earn an average annual income and spend normally in the mall. Okay, so interesting. We have these different clusters of customers. And so now, some business strategies or business ideas or, marketing ideas would be, for example, to target better our customers. For example, these customers here who belong to cluster 3 and are characterized by a high annual income and a high spending score, well, to these customers, we could totally target them the most when there are some new offers, some new deals. Because indeed, these are with these customers that you'll get the highest chance to sell your products, right? Because they spend a lot and besides they have a high annual income, therefore a high potential to buy a lot of stuff. But then, as a mall, you are responsible and you have some ethics. Well, for these customers who seem to earn a low annual income but yet seem to have a problem spending too much maybe in the mall, well, maybe that the mall would like to be responsible and protect these customers by not targeting them too much with new deals and new irresistible offers that, after all, maybe these customers don't need at the end of the day. So yes, if there is some social responsibility or some ethics in the mall, well, they would limit perhaps the targeting to these customers, the advertising and all the digital marketing deployed to these customers, right? So that's another insight we could get or another new action item in the strategy, which aims to indeed boost the business, but at the same time be socially responsible. Then what can we do with these clusters? Well, same, low annual income and low spending score. Well, if I was in the board of the mall, I would actually not do anything with this cluster because, we don't really have to protect them because they don't spend much. And besides, they have a low income, so we don't want to target them too much. What about this one now? A high annual income and a low spending score. Well, that's another cluster that would be interesting to target, right? Because maybe we're missing out on a lot of customers who don't seem to take much action in the mall here. So maybe, for these clusters, we could brainstorm on how to send them some better advertising that attract them more and track them better into the mall so that they can purchase more products and increase their spending score. So that's what I would do with this cluster. I would try to improve the advertising so that they can become better customers, more loyal customers who spend more in the mall. And finally, well, this cluster, again, not much we could do because at the same time we would like to target them, but not too much because we don't want to target the ones that have a low annual income. So we want to protect them at the same time. And there you go. I wouldn't do too much here. But you see, that's exactly the purpose of doing clustering. We identified some different clusters of customers, and for each of them, we can deploy different marketing strategies or different business strategies which will boost the customers in some of the clusters and will protect them in other clusters. You see the point? That's exactly the kind of insights that you can get from clustering. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this practical activity. Congratulations, of course, for building, training, and running this k-means algorithm on this dataset. I remind that here we got a clear visualization because we only chose 2 features, but keep in mind that the k-means algorithm can be run on datasets with many features, more than 2, but in that case you won't get that clear visualization, but you will still get, that vector containing all the different cluster numbers for each of your observations. And then you can still gather them in different groups corresponding to each of the clusters. All right, so that implementation still works very well for your other datasets with more features. That's what I wanted to say. And now, my friends, we're going to move on to the next section, which will either be about, k-means in R if you also want to learn R, or if you're only into Python, well, you will join me in the next section after that to implement this time another type of clustering model, which is hierarchical clustering. So whatever you choose, I can't wait to see you soon in a new section. And until then, enjoy machine learning.